this episode of the G4 Controller Series, we're going to add some electronics to your Sumobot switches. You're going to need to gather some materials that we're going to be using over the next couple of videos. To begin with, you're going to need 4 different color of wire. Each one of these wires is 11 centimeters long. So get that. You're also going to need approximately 5 feet of 4-strand cable. This is 22 gauge wires in this cable. You can use 24 gauge, you can go bigger than that. Doesn't really matter. Here are the switches, or the switch components that you finished building in the last tutorial video. So you're going to need to do a little bit of cleanup on those. Specifically, we need to do some cleanup on the switch bodies. The switch bodies, depending on your 3D printer, might have a little bit of a skirt or a little bit of flashing here around the openings. It's important that you cut that away. Over here I've got the tops off of 8 interior finishing nails. These are a bright finish nail. They don't have any ribs on the shaft, so they're a smooth shank nail. And these were just generic from Canadian Tire. Each one of these nail tops is 10 millimeters long. And these particular nails have a shaft or shank diameter of 2.5 millimeters. If you have different nails that you're working with, then you are going to have to modify or drill out the switch bodies accordingly. If everything has been done correctly, then the nail head should just slide into the body like this. You're also going to need some steel or copper contact pads that the nails are going to connect with inside of the switch body. Here I'm just using rectangular portions of 1/32 ungalvanized sheet metal that I picked up at Princess Auto. I've also seen it at PV Mart. So you just need to make sure that the steel is bare and has no coating on it. You're going to need a piece of perforated circuit board, or just perf board. This is a piece that I got off eBay, and it's got copper contacts on one side only. If you have a piece that has contacts on both sides, that's fine. And I don't need a very big piece for what I'm doing here, so I've cut this in quarters, and so I'm only going to be using 1/4 of that perf board. And lastly, we have some tools. So here is a wire stripper. Make sure that it can actually strip wire of the gauge that you're using. These wires here are 22 gauge. The wires in my cable are 22 gauge, and so this is a wire stripper from SparkFun that will strip 22 gauge. And I've also seen wire strippers from Canadian Tire that will also strip that size. This is a 3.5 millimeter drill bit. It's not that particular that you use that size. I just happen to have a collection of metric bolts. So these are 3 millimeter bolts, and so this is an oversized drill bit. Again, because I'm using 3 millimeter bolts, these are the 3 millimeter nuts and 3 millimeter washers that I need for this. And these are oversized washers, and specifically these are washers with a 1/8 inner diameter hole. And these washers are generic from your local hardware store. I happen to have a collection of metric nuts. You could use machine thread components or small gauge bolts that you can find at Canadian Tire. You don't need to use metric for this. It's just what I happen to have on hand. These are hex head bolts. So this is the 3 millimeter hex key that I'm going to use with the bolt. And these particular nuts, you require a 5.5 millimeter wrench, and this is just from a an ignition wrench set that I bought from Princess Auto. So again, whatever you happen to have on hand will work just fine. These are the tools that I have, and so I'm using them. And this is a pair of flush cut cutters, and they're going to come in handy a little bit later. This is a piece of 4mm plywood that I got at the local hardware store. It just needs to be big enough to hold our switch components later on. So the specific size that I'm using was just a random cut. My recommendation for you is that you look at what you have on hand and then you cut it to size based on the size of your switches. So that about does it for gathering the materials. This is a third hand. I'm going to be using this for holding on to the nails and holding on to some of the wires while I'm soldering. So let's get started. For this project, I'm going to be using 0.8mm rosin core solder, and I've got a fine tip soldering iron that I'm going to be using. To begin with, I'm going to be adding a little bit of solder to the end of the nail heads that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to do that with the third hand, and I need to insulate the nail from the pincer on the third hand, and I'm going to do that using a couple of pieces of paper. That way it doesn't take so long to heat the nail head up. This needs to be done to all 8 of the nails, but I'm going to do just one of them on camera here. So I'm going to start by placing the paper pad around the nail shank, and I'm going to put that in the pincer. And I'm going to set my soldering iron to approximately 360 degrees. And I'm going to get a little bit of liquid solder on the end of my soldering iron. And I'm going to just work at this until I see the solder starting to cling to the nail head. To start with, it might seem like the solder is sticking, but you want to get the nail hot enough to make sure that it actually sticks. And you'll be able to tell because as you move the soldering iron around, you'll start to see that the solder leaves your tip and clings to the nail head. So we've now got a decent little bead of solder on the end of the nail. You don't want to cover the entire nail. You want to make sure that the solder is only covering at most half the nail. And this will become important when we assemble the switches later. Next, I'm going to add solder to the contact pads. We have 4 contact pads. We're going to be placing a dot of solder in this pattern on the 4 contact pads. And so it's the same principle as with the nail. You get a little bit of solder on the end of your tip, and you hold it there until the solder releases from your tip and clings to the metal. And I want to repeat that this should be non-galvanized metal. You do not want to be soldering on a galvanized piece of steel. It creates a toxic gas that's really bad for you. So you can see how I keep lifting my soldering tip to see if the solder will stick to the steel instead of my tip. And so I've now achieved that. So now I have a nice little daub of solder just in the bottom corner of this piece of steel. And now I'm going to do that to all 8 of the pieces of steel, again, making sure that I'm following this pattern. At this point, you should have all of the solder on your nail heads, and you should have 2 sets of pads, all with the solder in the right areas. Now it's time to bare our wires. So we're going to strip a little bit of insulation off the end of our wires, and we're going to tin them so that it's easier to attach these wires to the contact pads and onto the nails. You're only going to need to strip about 4 to 5 millimeters off the end of your wire So approximately like that. You don't need any more than that. Going to do all of them. Like so. Now I'm going to add a little bit of solder to the wires. This is going to be really important if you are using a stranded wire. This is solid core wire that I have here. That's just a single piece of copper with a little bit of tinning on it. But if you have a multi-strand piece of wire, something like this, then you're going to have multiple little fine wires that are not going to go through the perf board properly, and they might not fully get included in the soldering when you're soldering it onto the nail. So in a situation where you've got a wire like this, you want to add just a little bit of solder to it in order to make it so that you've got a nice single piece of wire to work with. So do that with all your wires, and then it's time to solder them onto the pads and to the nails. Let's begin by adding the wires to our contact pads. We're going to be using this pattern here for how we're going to attach the wires. So we're going to use red and black like so. So I'm going to begin by adding my red wire to the left-hand side there. And if you haven't tinned your wires, you need to do that now. And you add a little bit of solder to your soldering iron tip and use that to help you melt the solder bead on the contact pad. When you add the wire, push the wire in from the bottom of the pad and push it into the solder bead. If you don't wait long enough to do that, the wire will wick away the heat from the solder bead and you won't be able to push it in. Remember to leave the wire in while the solder is solidifying. Okay, we're going to do that now with the black wire as well. And again, I'm going to add just a little bit of solder to the tip. And I'll heat this bead up. There we go. And I'm going to push this wire in from the bottom. And there we are. So we have our wire here. Notice that I have the wires pointing towards me. The wires are going to go into a hole in the middle of your wire block. And here we have another black, and it's oriented in the opposite direction. So all of the wires point towards the center, and we have the same thing here. So there we are. We have our reds, and we have the blacks. Next up, we're going to add the wires to our nail heads. We're going to be using this pattern for adding the wires. We're going to have, for our two different colors of wire, we're going to have two wires going in one direction and two wires soldered in from the other direction. Notice that the solder pad is at the bottom of the nail in this diagram. And I'm going to show you a trick to make soldering this on a lot easier. But for right now, this is the pattern that we're going to be following along with. So I'm going to bring out the third hand here and my two little pieces of paper to insulate my nail. And here we're going to do two of these nail heads, and I'll do the others off camera. So as before, take and wrap the nail in the two pieces of paper and put them in the pincher for your third hand. Now I'm going to start with my green wire. Remember, the wire color doesn't matter, just 4 of the same color is what you need. And I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to the end of my wire, and I've got a little bit of solder on my tip here, and I'm going to heat the solder pad up on this nail now. And this can sometimes be tricky, especially if you don't have the heat on your soldering iron turned up. I haven't changed mine. I'm still sitting at 360. So once your solder bead has become liquid, push the wire into the solder bead and make sure that the solder extends to the top of the nail. And leave it a moment to cool off, and then you can remove it from the pincher. So if we're looking at the diagram, I now have 1 of my 4 nails for the green wire. So this is the one that I've got here. And you'll notice that I started by having the solder bead on the nail pointed closest to me. Well, this time I'm going to rotate the nail so that the solder bead is farthest from me. And so I'll wrap this nail in my paper. And the reason I'm doing it like this is because I'm right-handed, and I'm going to continue to use the soldering iron with my right hand. And trying to solder in the wire and hold it in the opposite way that I have been is a little bit awkward. So this actually makes it a little bit easier. We're going to get the same effect for these 2 wires down here. So I'm just doing it from the top this time. And I'm still holding it in my left hand, and I'm still pushing it in. So just waiting for this to melt. There we go. Push it in. There we are. Get a little bit of the solder on top of the wire, making sure that the wire and the solder do not extend past the halfway mark on your nail. And so now, when I rotate this around, I've got the wire oriented, pointing to the right. So that's a fairly simple way of doing it. And so when you have this all done, you're going to end up with a collection of nails. Let's just see here. So that one is pointed in this direction. This one is pointed in this direction. There's 2 more. There we are. And here's my other color. So I now have the wires soldered onto all 4 nails. And in the next episode, we're going to start building the circuit board for our switch. And we'll be attaching all of these wires into the circuit board that we make.